Let's talk about psychology, specifically psychological limitations as a disadvantage. There are so many little bits and pieces of this, you'll have to think of these as a whole bunch of little parts that all fit together, and I'm just naming them one after the other. The first thought about the psychological limitations is that they are not do's and don'ts. There's will not perhaps, or doesn't want to, or won't. Something like that might be in the title of the psychological limitation, but the psychological limitation's name is the viewpoint of the character. It is not in and of itself a stricture on action. As I have said, Champions Now is an amoral game. There is nothing that locks your character into a particular role except the way that you choose to play that character. Let's take a look at that first of all. We've got the psychological limitation as the character's position. So that's some good news right there, isn't it? You have no straitjacket on when playing the character. In that case, what is the psychological limitation for? And the answer is a springboard into more situations. Viewpoint. That's there in the title of it. Now let's take a look at those numbers. In the original game, you have 3 categories for how often it might show up. I have sort of a difficulty, I always have, with understanding the middle category of any such spectrum. I know what unusual, rare, weird, unlikely, I know what those mean. And I also know what, if not constant, at least likely, common, arounds, could run into. I know what that means too. But I don't know what a designated intermediate, like very common, uncommon, common, I don't know what that means. So I got rid of it. 5 points for the, the weird, unusual, uncommon. 15 points for the run into it all the time, could very well run into it pretty soon. Another interesting point about it is that we haven't said any word about the relative extremity of the position in ordinary human social terms. As written, and as it should be done, it doesn't matter how extreme that position is. That position could be some kind of bizarre paranoid conspiracy craziness position, or it could be something, as like an opinion, that most people actually have. It doesn't matter. So the extremity of the position itself has no role in terms of the points. All you're saying by taking it as a psychological limitation is that it is important to your character. They do hold this position and it matters to them. Now for the rest of the points, which have to do with the response. I chose the word provocation in my slight rewrite of the disadvantage because the idea being the character encounters something that provokes their position. It may, for example, be a good example of what they like or approve of, or of combating the thing that they don't like, in which case they might be very positively inclined to respond positively, or it could be the reverse. The point is that the position the character has is provoked. It's brought forward by whatever it is that they've encountered. Note that it does not specify a single particular provocation. The position is the position. It could be provoked for good or ill in an infinite number of ways. So don't think of a psychological limitation as like, it has to be this color, it has to be this thing, it has to be this one thing, it has to be a 3-legged cat. No, any number of things can provoke a given person's position on something. Now how about the response? The default is no more points. That's actually a pretty good idea. Think about that. Go ahead and have a character who's got a strongly self-characterizing position, and they will opine about it. They may take action as you see fit regarding it or not upon the provocation, and that's totally up to you, and that's enough. That actually accounts for most sensible, playable, and interesting psychological limitations, and it would be worth either 5 or 15 points based on that commonality thing. You want to add to that, This is where more points come from, and it is a price. This is a very significant choice about your character. For example, irrational response. That's the minimum, is an irrational response. 5 more points. If it's a weird or unusual provocation, 5 more points for this irrational response. It's only 10 points of a disadvantage, which isn't very much, and there you have your character acting out, if you want to use that term, upon encountering it. Something common, and they have that particular irrational response at the provocation, whatever that irrational response to you may mean or occurs to you as the way to go, whether they're reacting positively or reacting negatively. It seems pretty extreme. Your character's bent if you take that particular addition. It's not an ordinary, even a highly opinionated response, which they can do or will do in response to it ordinarily. No, it's an irrational response. Whatever that means to you and your collective play group, it should be different from what you think of as a rational response. Let's go on to that meltdown response for significantly more points. Here's where we get pretty hardcore response. The provocation comes up and the character is rendered non-functional. They either become so bonkers about things that they collapse, or they do something completely disorganized. This is not attacking the thing they don't like. In that case, you would want to take a look at Enrage or Berserk. If you want to go that way, then combining a psychological limitation with an Enrage or Berserk in terms of their coherence together makes perfectly good sense. But taken by itself, the psychological limitation means upon the provocation at this extreme level, the character falls apart. Interestingly enough, that means it wouldn't work together with Enrage and Berserk at that level. You can't go after your target with violent intent and melt down at the same time. So let's take a look at a character with that situation. A character where the provocation is common, daily, ordinary, likely to happen, even predictable, who has a complete dysfunctional meltdown about it, is nigh unplayable. You may want to consider that rather carefully. You can play a character like that, but you're going to be spending a great deal of time with the character in a state of collapse or disorganized activity. Keep this stuff in mind. It's perfectly okay to take a reasonable position that has an occasional provocation, and perhaps you have an irrational response to it. It does kind of get to you, and the character doesn't really behave well when that crops up. That's interesting and fun to play. But these are not gimme points. You want to rack it up into that above 20-point realm. You want to get the really hefty points out of psychological limitation. And you are playing somebody who's responding a lot or responding to a remarkably extreme degree. All these in mind should be springboards for play. Take a look at your psychological limitations. You'll find ways to tie them to powers. You'll find ways to tie them to other disadvantages. You'll find all kinds of ways for them to make sense. So to sum up across all these kind of disconnected or apparently non-linear parts that I've just rattled off, the whole picture, I think, comes together pretty nicely. Looking at these in the character, there's all kinds of great ways to connect them up with everything else. I already mentioned how Enrage or Berserk can be treated as sort of a subset of a psychological limitation. I also have shown in a couple of examples of how different limitations on powers or characteristics could be tied to the operation of psychological limitations. And finally, there's just plain logical coherence when you look and say, well, this character, for example, in one of my games, a soldier from the future kind of character, has a built into his body killing attack. And as having gone AWOL from the future war and come to what this character considers to be an age of peace, where he wants to live in peace and be away from that war, he has a pretty dedicated aversion to killing. So you see, it's not just CDK thrown onto the sheet for some points, it actually ties into the character's capabilities and background, other psychological limitations, being hunted, of course, by the, by the future war people who want him to come back to it, all those things, and bearing in mind that an aversion for killing makes a whole lot more sense for a character who's capable of it. Now we're talking. Psychological limitation, yes, but story limitation, characterization limitation, player choice limitation, not even a little.